Welcome to the Monsters of Fantasy. This was written, produced, recorded, and edited by me, Shawn McCarter. Monsters of Fantasy is a production in which I will explore the truly horrific side of the fantasy world known as Dungeons and Dragons. There are content warnings in the show notes below. Episode 2: The Pixie.
Hello, Nico. Just as you requested, we'll be doing a Fae entry next. I don't know if you get these right away or not, but if you do, then we all here at the castle wish you a safe return. If not, just disregard what was just said. Statement given by Freya regarding the Pixies. Yes, they are real. Unicorns, fairies, and whatever pink creature you dreamt of as a small child. They exist in a land far away called the Feywild. You can find almost everything a little girl could ever dream of there. Talking animals, flying horses, all of these things exist beyond the door. But you have to find the door first. And what you may find on the other side you may not like. I did, of course, love it. And so did my grandmother. You see, she's the one that first found the door, long before I was ever born. I never knew my mother and was told she died during childbirth. My father had left even earlier than that, so I was left to be raised alone by my grandmother. I'm not going to give you some long, tragic backstory about how that all affected me. And to be honest, she did a great job raising me. I don't blame the absence of my parents for how I turned out. No, for that I guess I have the door to blame. For as far back as I can remember, my grandmother told me stories of a magical door made of twisting branches that opened up into a rainbow of lights. She told me stories of all kinds of fairy tale creatures. Dancing satyrs, singing nymphs, and leaping leprechauns. And all we had to do was find that door once again. While she would tell me stories nightly, we never really looked for the door. My grandmother would talk about it, and I would listen in wonderment, just imagining a world better than ours. The years would continue, and eventually I outgrew bedtime stories. But I did not outgrow the curiosity to explore. As soon as I was old enough to explore the woods alone, at least during the day, you bet I was out there adventuring. I would spend hours in the woods local to the house, never walking more than a mile or two in any direction, but as a kid it was amazing. It felt like every day I would find some new cool tree that I would just imagine talking to me. I would find bees fluttering in a small field and pretend they were little fairies fluttering about. I'd always search for the next thing in hopes that it would be the big, twisting door. The summer after my 12th birthday, I'd wandered into a young little boy out in the middle of the woods. He had to be about 3 or 4 years my younger, and he said his dad dropped him off at his aunt's farm, about a 30-minute walk north of here. I knew he was talking about the Vanderhorns, but I remember my grandmother said that the Vanderhorns liked to keep to themselves, that they didn't want to talk to us. Though I was young and honestly was just happy to have a friend to play make-believe in the woods with. So over the course of the next few days, Nathan and I, as I later found out his name, would meet up in the woods. He would pretend to be tracking some great beast, and we would defeat it with the help of our magical friends. Or I would climb up a tall tree, pretend to be some damsel trapped, and Nathan would slay whatever monster was keeping us there. We played all sorts of games like that. The day that changed my life was just another one of those days. Another day of me and Nathan exploring the woods and pretending to track some evil witch that had kidnapped one of the locals. I remember Nathan and I pretended to surround the witch, and as Nathan stood across from me shouting that the evil witch return her crafter to us, I lifted my hands up to cast a spell at the evil witch. I don't remember what spell I thought I was casting at the time, Just kids pretending to know magic, right? I do remember his shouts, though. The loud, piercing shrills that Nathan produced as the sickening green acid that was spraying out of my hands coated him. I stood for a very brief moment just looking at him in disbelief. I believe I just stood there, still thinking it was all pretend. You know, that being someone's first encounter with the Fae, let alone magic in general, would probably turn them off of magic forever. And honestly, it should have. Scared and panicked, I ran as hard as my little legs could go, carrying me back to the only safety I knew. If anyone could fix it, it would have to be her. I don't know how long it took, but when I made it back to the house, my grandmother was sitting on the porch knitting some clothes for the coming winter. As soon as she saw me, she started to run, meeting me halfway. She looked over me in fear, as it seemed my clothes had small little holes throughout the fabric, and appeared to have been burned with hundreds of tiny little matches. Other than that, though, I was perfectly fine, and before my grandmother could say anything, I rambled as fast as I could about everything. But I was explaining what happened to Nathan. She almost looked excited, and the turning and observing my hands turned from fear to wonder. Her eyes started beaming, and she ran into the house, shouting for me to follow. I stood in the doorway watching as she was rummaging from an old chest that she kept in her room, and after a few seconds of her throwing stuff around, one of which was an actual short sword. You have to understand me, at the time my mind was blown. My little halfling grandmother casually tossing a short sword around, but that's another story in itself. She hobbled over to me, gently holding this long flowing fabric in her hand. It was made of a deep, deep purple, but in the purple fur were tiny specks of glittering silver, making the fabric look like it was flowing constantly. She then asked me to tell her exactly where I had left him. Within seconds of me rambling about a tree that was rather taller than the others, she draped the fabric around both of us, and my vision turned into purple shimmering blurs. Now this was the first time of many that I would teleport, and trust me, I was absolutely thrilled, but I will struggle to explain the joy and thrill I felt. How could I? You had to experience the fear as my vision turned into a swirling mix of colors and my grandmother vanished from my sight. In the span of seconds, but what felt like hours, I watched reality shift aside as I propelled through a tunnel of purple and silver. And at the end of the tunnel, I saw what looked like the tree that I had been describing. And then I found myself at the base of said tree as a cloud of purple and glittering smoke started to disappear. I started to look around where I had left Nathan, but he seemed to be nowhere around. My grandmother had already put the cloak away and was frantically looking around the small clearing. I shouted and pointed where I had left him, but she wasn't looking to where I was gesturing. Instead, she started asking me where I had cast the spell from, at which point she ran over and started inspecting where I stood. I was looking for Nathan, though. I remember noticing the small area that Nathan and I were in had been covered in glitter. Almost that of my grandmother's cloak, but there were blues and pinks. I started to mention it when I noticed small vines that definitely weren't there before, extending from where my grandmother was standing. She started cursing underneath her breath, and I ran up to see what was wrong, and she was crying. I thought it was for Nathan, but I quickly realized it was for her beloved door. She turned and slowly gripped my shoulders. She told me that we were too late, and that she was proud of me. She told me that I shouldn't be afraid of the powers that I now possess. I was so confused at the time, but as she started to smile while looking over my hands, I couldn't help but smile and feel appreciated. I never saw Nathan again, and I'm assuming he hadn't told his aunt where he was running off to in the afternoon, because they never came over to our house. I remember my grandmother leaving one day, saying she would take care of it, but never did they mention anything to us after the event. And like I said, we kept to ourselves mostly. Over the course of the next 4 years, until I would turn 16, my grandmother taught me how to use magic. For a while I was just happy that I, some little farmer, would become a powerful magical princess. I never questioned where my powers came from. but I knew it came from the door. I felt something that day blossom inside me, and it's only been growing bigger. Eventually I was old enough and my grandmother had to tell me the truth. Supposedly she met a fine young man while out in the woods when she was younger. The man she described was the most beautiful creature I had ever heard of before. She called him Lazaran. She told of meeting with Lazaran for weeks in the forest outside of our home and talking to him. They would share details of each other's home, hers of a simple farmer's daughter, and his having lived decades in a realm full of magic and mystery. She told me how this man told her about his home, the Feywild, and after not too long begged him to take her there. But you didn't come for a statement about me. I'm not a pure Fey, right? I'll keep the story very short, but this beautiful man had seduced my grandmother, and after creating my mom, vanished. My mom was raised as normal and showed no signs of Fey magic, and as the years dragged on, my grandmother feared she would never see the man again. It was around the time of my birth, she said, that she would last see Lazaran. She had been out in the woods gathering some firewood when he approached her. He seemed to be shocked that she had almost aged 25 years, and within seconds of their encounter, he had made excuses about having to return back to his world, only to never return again. My grandmother was a strong woman, and had already raised my mother all on her own, but she was a fool when it came to him. She kept reassuring herself that one day she would see him again, and she believed it up until the day she passed away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a late spring afternoon, and while I was with a boy, another local farm hand. He was a few years older than I, but he was a hard-working and nice boy, so I let him keep me company that afternoon. It was while we were sitting on the banks of a nearby pond that a small shimmering light started to form in front of us. Now my grandmother had taught me a little bit about how to control my magic, but I still wasn't allowed to use it without her supervision, unless I was really in danger. I should also mention at this point my magic would occasionally not work as intended. I later learned that this was quite common. It seems to happen to other humanoid creatures who bred with magical beings that they shouldn't have. Sometimes those children are born with absolute control over limitless power, and some are just merely conduits of power and spend their lives controlling it. And while at the time I didn't know it, I was the latter. I immediately recognized that whatever was happening in front of us was arcane. Poor Barty, though, just saw shimmering lights. Before I could say anything, he had already hurled himself into the pond. It was only 20 or so feet across, and he would be on the other side in mere seconds. I stood there frozen, because in front of me was the beautiful twisting of vines and roots. They started up from the ground itself and quickly grew into the crude shape of a large door. For what creature I know not, because it seemed the vines just kept stretching unbelievably high before they curled into one another at the top. Once they did so, the space they now wrapped around started to glimmer with an unbelievably bright light. At this point, Barty had swam across and was climbing up on the other bank. I was starting to step in, myself after him, but I stopped to shield my eyes. In front of me, silhouetted by a block of light, Barty reached towards the door. Before his fingers could reach through, I saw 8 tiny little colored lights shoot out of the door. They started flying around Barty and caused him to lose his footing. I pulled out my tiny owl feather and shouted to stop him from falling. I felt the now familiar surge of magic flow through me, but it felt different this time. It felt stronger, more powerful. I knew something was going to go wrong, so I braced myself. But to my surprise, he seemed totally fine, and he rolled the rest of the way down the hill, splashing next to me. I quickly asked if he was okay, to which he just stared open-mouthed, pointing towards the gate into the Feywild. I keep thinking back to how probably the most terrifying few seconds of his life may have been my happiest. I looked up at the gate, and the buzzing swirl of lights was making its way towards us. Behind them, stepping out of the gate, was a full-grown unicorn that came charging towards us. It leapt clear over our heads and was gone within seconds, but I will never forget its long, flowing golden hair that seemed to faintly glow, leaving an after-image behind us, or its long, spiraling horn that it gracefully carried upon its skull. And it just vanished before us, my admiration cut short by Barty's shrill scream. I looked over and saw tiny little lights had swarmed us. But they weren't lights at all. They were butterflies. No. They were tiny people. Swarming all around us were tiny little men and women with butterfly wings. They floated and trailed around us with arcs of glitter and sounded as if a cacophony of birds and chimes were singing all around us. Later I would learn the pixies were speaking Sylvan, but at the time I was just captivated by the beauty of their sounds. I held up my hand and one of them landed lightly there, catching and steadying itself using my fingers. He said something to me, but I have no idea what it was. I was just so transfixed with this tiny creature. He had to be no bigger than my hand. His skin was that of a light green, and his wings matched. But his wings looked like veins. No, leaves that carried him on the wind. He wore a shirt that seemed to be wove out of blades of grass, and the grass then wove together into tiny little flower petals to make a colorful dress. And with a cute, whimsical wink, he completely vanished, leaving a small puff of glitter. I looked over to see Barty levitating up in the air as another tiny winged creature fluttered by and blinking out of existence. He started to panic and wail about as he rose higher and higher. As his feet flapped about wildly, he almost kicked another pixie that was flying up underneath him. As it did so, more dust coated him, and everywhere the dust touched, tiny little seeds burrowed their way into his skin, all over his legs and arms. The little pixies giggled as it too blinked out of existence, its sound replaced by screaming as Barty clutched his arms and legs that had now begun to sprout tiny little yellow and red flowers. Again I raised my hands and reached deep down into myself and tried willing Barty back to the ground. But as I held my hands out, tiny little butterflies and flowers made of light started to dance around me. I must admit the sight was very beautiful, but high above me another pixie was fluttering above Barty, pouring more dust into his messy hair. Barty's features began to warp and change. His nose became elongated, his body began rapidly shrinking. Pure terror was on his face as tiny brown fur started to sprout all over it. I heard a loud and painful crack as his spine started to protrude out of his body, almost like a tail. And within seconds the screams of Barty turned into this high-pitched squeal of a squirrel squirming in the air. I should have been more scared, but I just stood there in wonder and disbelief at what was happening in front of my eyes. I knew magic was real, obviously, but what these creatures could do with ease, I wanted as well. I envied the world they came from. In the air, Squirrel Barty was being tortured, and all I could do was watch and wonder how they did it. One after another, I watched as a pixie would fly up and sprinkle some dust and cast another spell. While I did not know their language, I knew they were laughing and playing, that what they were doing to Barty were only a game to them. I was in awe at the beauty of the creatures, their power, but disgusted that something could gain delight in what they were doing. The next one, floating up on pink rose petals, turned him into a young fawn, which he spent the entire time bucking his hooves wildly. I think this particularly pleased them, because the sounds of their high-pitched laughter began to rise to almost a point of being disorienting. Then, just as quick as it all started, it ended. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds in total, but the last pixie blinked out of existence and reverted Barty back to normal, and he was now falling. I also noticed that the light bathing us was starting to dim, and it seemed that the vines and roots that comprised the door were starting to untwist themselves. I also noticed that the light that was bathing us had started to dim, and it seemed that the vines and roots that comprised the door were starting to untwist themselves. I leapt and crawled my way to the gate. I heard a loud splash behind me, but didn't dare look. I couldn't miss this. I had to go into their world, but I could tell I wouldn't make it, so I dug down and used all the magic I could that was still left in my body. Fortunately, the spell worked, and I found myself able to leap into the air, soaring the remainder of the way to the door. All my dreams were coming true, and I would finally be able to experience the world that my grandmother had spent a lifetime reminiscing about. But I fell short, and as my fingers touched the edge of the fading light and my body passed through the now empty air, I began to cry. Not a loud cry, but a silent weep for myself and for what I had lost. I picked myself up and turned around to an almost drowned, but otherwise all right Barty. He, however, was terrified and was scrambling out of the pond, first screaming about what happened to him, then about how I was a witch, and that I brought this on to him. He was right, of course, but he ran away before I could really get a word in, and I didn't really want to, honestly. I was just sad. Sad that my kin had left me. Why did they leave me here when I was clearly one of their own? I don't know how long I sat there wandering. Long enough, though, that Barty's shouts and cryings had long faded away. It didn't matter, though, because no one ended up believing him, or at least that's what I think happened. I remember his parents coming over once the following week, but they left shortly after talking with my grandmother, and I never saw them around the house again. I would, however, see Barty a few more times over the coming months. The first of which was at the same spot that he had been tortured by the Pixies. He didn't notice me walking up, and so I silently watched him. Now, I'd been there to cast a few spells, just in case I could bring the door back. But I sat and watched as he pounded the ground crying and shouting about no one believing him. I didn't dare step out because I didn't want any of that rage directed at me. So I just sat there and watched for the next half hour or so while he lashed out at the world, both ours and theirs. I would go on to see him a few more times in the woods, reliving that day in his own mind. But as the months turned to years, I started seeing him less and less, until I just noticed he was gone. It would be a few months after that realization that my grandmother would pass away peacefully in her sleep. With her, Barty, and Nathan all gone, I had nothing left to tie me to that house and the forest that surrounded it. So I packed up all my stuff and began adventuring, because I no longer needed to wander a forest to make a connection with the Feywild. Oh, unfortunately, this account has to be taken with a grain of salt. There's absolutely nothing to verify any of her statements. The only names were that of two relatively unimportant people in an unknown location, and of course we couldn't locate Miss Freya for a follow-up. The only thing that seemed to be relevant aside from the Pixies was the very well-known gate that served as a bridge from our world to the world of the Fae. Those were nicer times, but Daisy says she heard the name Lazaran before, but at the time of submitting this, we can't seem to find anything that would indicate exactly what he is. I did send Cadwin out to Hill Swallowed Farms, as that area tends to have a lot of halflings, and the farms are located near the Raven's Forest. Unfortunately, he spent an entire week there, only returned with nothing. I'm almost positive he just used it as a vacation while you were away, Nico. Anyways, I'm getting a bit off topic. The Pixie. Physiology. Freya's description of the Pixie was spot on. A full-grown Pixie typically stands between 30 and 60 centimeters tall, making them one of the smaller monsters to grace our studies. Most of their humanoid features resemble that of a wood elf. Their skin is usually shades of green, typically darker hair, and pointed ears. All Pixies have a set of wings very reminiscent of a butterfly. Each one has a unique, vibrant pattern, and they tend to dress themselves in plant life, like fashioning gowns made of flowers or hats made of acorns. Weaknesses and resistances. Funnily enough, it seems the only weakness we could observe about the Pixie is its size. The Pixie itself is hard to get a hold of due to some of its abilities, but if you were to pretty much do anything harmful to them, they would probably die. However, like our previous entry, they contain a natural resistance to magical effects. Abilities. Let's cover the two obvious ones. They're able to fly, and they're able to cast spells. This is a bit more of a chaotic area. The Pixie seems to be able to innately cast a spell, and each Pixie uses a fine powder that they source from the Feywild as their material component for these spells. Because of this, we deduce that the spells that they cast in their Sylvan tongue must have been passed down from their ancestors. This would explain how every Pixie possesses the ability to create glowing lights, cause plant growth, and to turn invisible. Beyond that, however, it starts to become heavily variated. Some groups of Pixie knows how to polymorph other creatures, while others know how to cast illusionary magic so strong that it can actually hurt another creature. I guess normally attacking would be what follows next, but they don't really attack. They are playful and mischief creatures, and while Barty may have been mentally scarred, those Pixies did not truly mean him harm. A Pixie will use everything in its disposal to defend itself, if it need be, but they'll do just as much to amuse themselves. And like a lot of other Fey creatures, what amuses the mind of a Fey can cause terror in the minds of a mortal.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed today's creepy story, make sure to let all your friends know to listen to Monsters of Fantasy on whatever platform they fancy. Today's story featured a Shawn original. While pixies and fae are traditionally seen as beautiful creatures, us adventurers seem to forget that, to a commoner, anything can be a monster. Join me next time, where we learn the dread that an elemental can bring.